We would like to invite Mr. Vinai that will be joining us online from Magento Association and Bapak Muliadi from iCube by Circlo to join on the stage and proceed the panel discussion. And please welcome Mr. Vinai and also Bapak Muliadi
Hey, welcome Vinai to the Meet Magento Indonesia. Good. We still have quite a number of people here still listening on us.
Lovely.
It's 5:30, sorry this running late now. But why don't you spend like the first 5-10 minutes introducing yourself and what you do and stuff like that.
Okay.
Go ahead, Vinai.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, my name is Vinai. I've been working with Magento for almost as long as Vikrant. So now I can see you too. That's very nice. Thanks for putting that stream on there. That's good. It's much easier to talk to people rather than just to talking to a screen. So that's nice. Yeah, I've been working as a developer mainly with Magento. And I'm very involved in the Magento community, especially, of course, the developer community, but beyond that also with all the other aspects of the community, all the tech partners, agencies, extension vendors, etc. So I'm here today because I'm very much interested in the future of Magento OpenSource, and Muliadi invited me here. Thank you again for the opportunity. And I wanted to talk a bit about MageOS and represent this aspect of Magento OpenSource, or the story around Magento OpenSource during the conference here. So let's actually not part of the Magento Association, but actually outside of it, which I think is another good point to be at. So yeah, I've got a few slides here to go over, because I think before we start the panel, it might be good just to explain a little bit, that you would otherwise just come up as questions immediately. So we can cover those up front, and then we can start from a different point going into the discussion. Right?
Sure.
Okay. So the idea, what I want to represent here is MageOS. And the big question is, of course, what is this and how did we get here? And I won't, go through the whole long story, which is now almost 18 months from the very first start. But it can be very confusing. So there's Magento OpenSource and there's Adobe Commerce, and then there's the Magento Association. And recently, during the last Connect, actually 2 Connects ago, which is a Magento Association event, Adobe proposed a short-term support, long-term support strategy for Magento OpenSource, but that looks like that's already been taken out again. So it's kind of off the table. A lot of people actually still have that hanging around though. Then there's the Magento OpenSource Task Force. And so what are all these things, right? What all these have in common is that people are trying to find the best way forward in regards to Magento OpenSource. Right? So that's the lowest common denominator, and why all these people in the end are working together here, trying to find the right approach forward. And I think out of this multitude of approaches, there's a certain richness that is arising, even though all these names can be somewhat confusing without being familiar with the history. So MageOS in particular actually started out of a feeling of frustration with the enterprise focus of Adobe Commerce and the reduction in focus on Magento OpenSource. I mean, even Magento.com was removed now and just redirected to Adobe, which hurt a lot of businesses which have been built up on top of the Magento brand, especially Magento OpenSource. And that, in effect, you can read a lot more about that whole story on the website mageos.org. There was an open letter which really triggered a lot of, actually, let me just head over there. So it should switch over to Firefox right now. So here you can see on the mageos.org website. There's a open letter that was written last September, so almost a year ago, and within 2 weeks there were hundreds and hundreds of people who signed the letter and put their name out and the company below it because they felt this in a similar way. So it looks like we've certainly hit a certain nerve there, and there's a need for this more less enterprise focus, but extremely flexible commerce solution in the market. So Magento has been with us for many years and has been the growth bed of so many companies. And what Magento OS strives for is to be the home for all the businesses that have been built on top of Magento OpenSource. So that's the individual developers, of course, and the merchants who run their business on Magento OpenSource and systems built around it. And then there's the agencies. There are many agencies, hundreds and hundreds, who do exclusively open source builds, who do not do Adobe Commerce projects. And sometimes the merchants move on, but there's a big segment of the market that really lives from Magento open source. And then, of course, there are all the tech partners, like payment service providers, hosting solution providers, etc. And again, a large part of their business comes from Magento open source. And then there's, of course, the extension vendors. So thousands of businesses built on top of Magento open source. And the feeling that was coming from Adobe was that, well, they're very focused on a specific segment of the market that's well served by Experience Manager, by headless, by whatever offers their offer for their licensed solution there. But Magento open source can cover a lot more than only this one segment. So Magento OS basically guarantees that Magento open source will stay and will continue to grow, regardless of what the current owner of the brand, Magento Adobe, chooses to do. So the purpose of Magento open source, to put it in one nice little phrase there, is we want to enable the Magento ecosystem to thrive. And we do that by empowering the community, and we do that to, we empower them to maintain and develop Magento open source through communication and funding. So that's the purpose of Magento OS. Right? We empower the Magento ecosystem to thrive, to develop a version of Magento open source on their own, independently. So the question is, how are we doing that? Well, there are several pillars that we've built on. First of all, we have the Magento OS distributions. Now, the Magento OS distributions are versions of Magento open source. They're currently, we have two distributions, and there will be more in future. So what we currently have, we have the mirror distribution, which is a set of all previous Magento open source releases, but all the release packages, so the actual composer packages, are built independently of the Adobe processes. So it's more than just a fork of the GitHub repositories, it's also the process around it. So you can now choose to freely install either from the Magento OS mirrors or from repo magento.com, which is the Adobe repository for Magento open source. And what this gives you is just a bit of independence. Even if Adobe, and I don't think that that's likely to happen, but just in case, even if Adobe should choose to close down Magento open source, all that is required is replace one line in the composer JSON of the root project, and everything will continue to run as before. So that gives us a much stronger point to argue upon. We're not as dependent anymore. And to be honest, if I'm building a business, I like to be independent, and I don't want to be completely dependent on one external entity there. Another big thing that we build on is communication. And for example, that includes communication with Adobe. Ever since the open letter was written, we, as the community, part of the initial signatories of the letter, but also other people from the community, have been in intense communication with Adobe and with the Magento Association in bi-weekly meetings. This is meetings that were called into place by Adobe and by the Magento Association, called the Open Source Task Force. And even though nothing concrete has come out of this meetings, it has been invaluable because the position of all the people inside of Adobe who represent Magento open source and who believe in Magento open source and the value of it that it provides for Adobe, the position of these people inside of Adobe has become a lot stronger through these meetings, through this communication. And at the same time, the understanding of what's happening inside of Adobe, the understanding of the community, what's happening inside of Adobe has become a lot stronger. And that's super important. At the same time, there also has been a lot of communication with the community. So I've spoken at meetups, I've spoken at other events and on one-on-one meetings with people, and it's become very clear that there's a big demand for communication. In times of COVID, it's much harder to stay in touch. And by creating something like Magento around people which can gather and talk, this has greatly increased the opportunity for communication, both with Adobe as well as the different parts of the Magento ecosystem. And that's, again, I think that's incredibly valuable and has created a lot of opportunity there. And finally, there's event participation. So for example, I'm here, I'm talking at this event, and the topic of Magento open source has become a main topic in many of the Meet Magento events as well as the Magento Connect events since this initiative has started. So that's great. And we also want to expand that to find more local representation. So if you think that's something that's interesting to your business, be you a merchant or be you an agency or a developer, if you think that's important for you and you're located in the Indonesia region, feel free to join and be part of Magento as part of the local representation. Because we're a huge community, we're global, and it's important to have local representation because the needs and requirements and wants and the business of each geographic region is very unique, and that should be reflected. So yeah, that's definitely something we would like to have. My dream is that in future, for each event that happens, there's somebody who works with Magento, who's local, who's there in person, so it doesn't have to be a remote presentation or panel like I'm doing right now, but somebody who's there in person and who can speak to people and can really listen and talk to people. So I think that's important. And finally, community organization. So Magento is starting to, for example, organize, giving the community a channel to organize, for example, content creation about Magento open source. Currently, if people try to find like a merchant who's maybe being pitched a Magento open source solution by an agency, if he wants to find information about Magento open source, guess what happens? He gets redirected to an upsell to Adobe Commerce. So what message does that give him? What message does that say about the people implementing it? It's not ideal. So we are creating content through a content committee that provides unbiased comparison. Okay, this is what you get with Magento open source. This is what you get with Adobe Commerce. This is what you get with other platforms. You can compare them. You can see what features there are, what are the costs, etc. Build times. You can see showcases. You can see reference implementations, common questions and answers. All these things that are important for people to get an informed and not just a sales pitch information about the platform that they are probably about to invest a lot of money in, where a lot of money is always, of course, relative to the business investing it. For a business, a certain sum can be a lot of money, whereas for a big corporation, that might be peanuts. So, there's a lot of money for a business, regardless of its size, needs to be able to really make an informed decision. So these kind of organizations coming together, building this kind of content and other things that are needed, that's also a place that Magento provides. And in the end, what we're striving for is community ownership. We build our businesses on Magento, and Magento gives us the opportunity to take care of the things that we own, our business and also the platform we build upon. So a common question is, how can we help? And there's many ways. You, for example, or your business, if you want to support this, you can help. And most importantly, you can scratch your own itch. So one of the distributions that we're building beyond the mirror distribution, which is just the current previous releases of Magento OpenSource, will be a real fork with additional improvements that go beyond what Adobe Magento OpenSource currently is. Right, we still will have interoperability with Magento OpenSource and with Adobe Commerce. So it's always possible to migrate up and move to Adobe Commerce. But this additional distribution that we are building will be like a base distribution. People will be able to build their own distributions. We already have that currently with Magento OpenSource. So there are vendors who build versions of Magento OpenSource internally that they use only for their customers, that target a specific vertical, maybe wineries, maybe car parts, maybe other B2B solutions. And we optimize MageOS to be the base distribution that other people can build their own distributions on top of. We could have a light distribution with only a very minimal set of packages. We can have a head-full solution that doesn't even include GraphQL or REST API. We can have a headless distribution which doesn't even include Luma. So much more lightweight, specific distributions that are composed out of the Magento open source packages and built upon. So you can create your own independent version of Magento open source that targets exactly what you want to have built. So whatever your own itch is, maybe it's a specific bug or performance issue, maybe it's a specific vertical you want to target, maybe it's just being part of the community and you want to contribute, all of this is possible with MageOS. Of course, another way you can help is build stores. That's the core, of course, of commerce. We need to build stores. And that's currently already happening. Quite a few stores are being built based on the mirror repositories, and that's the important way to contribute to. Help build the infrastructure. We're currently in the process of building out the infrastructure to create this independent distribution. We have weekly meetings that are open. You can see more where that is at the mageos.org repository website. There you can find more information how to get in touch and participate in these weekly meetings. So there we talk through the current issues and how we're trying to solve them. Did the solution that we implement work or not? How can we do it better? And it's fun, it's good. And of course, creating content is super valuable too. So if you work with Magento open source and have built something that's worth showing, create a showcase out of it and share it. And the basic idea is, we believe that if the cake gets bigger, everybody wins. Right? Adobe wins and the whole ecosystem wins. And what we're making is we're making the cake bigger. So yeah, you can be part of that and also get a bigger piece of cake. So help spread the word about MageOS. If you have any questions, the panel now is a good opportunity to ask. And finally, I want to invite you to join us. Come to mageos.org, find the chat room there, ask questions, participate, be critical. That's super important too. So lots of constructive discussions going on there. Good, that's all from the slides. Hopefully it's a little bit clearer now what's going on with MageOS, what it is, why it's there. And if you have any questions, yeah, let's open up the panel.
Sure. I think we're gonna get a couple of discussion point here. I think the one that I can conclude that I think this is the best part about being in Magento, right? I mean, it's always started with the community, and the platform itself is always have a big support of the community. And I think this is just to even give the ensurement, but from the business perspective, the investment that they made, the community is really active to make sure that investment itself is long lasting and there is a commitment on both from the community on the open source area as well from Adobe. I think Vikrant, maybe you can share a bit. I mean, I quite sure. I mean, there's a few that Adobe also have already stated as far as like some of the commitment into the platform itself, and Adobe has been a very good track record on keeping up the open source technology that they invest on.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think the point that Vinai made does make sense, and coming from all those old days of Magento and Magento open source, and evolving and then getting acquired by Adobe, and now the things going more into the Adobe Commerce Cloud or Commerce Cloud or the commerce world. Sometimes there is certainly a fear. Again, nothing to take away from the community, but change is always hard. That is something that I have always been saying, writing about on LinkedIn's and all. In terms of Adobe's commitment, I think for the very first time since last year's, and thanks to the open letter and other initiative by the Adobe Magento community, Adobe have started publishing a separate roadmap for Magento, right? So even Magento did not publish a roadmap for Magento when it was Magento. So that is a big change, right? Because now as a Magento community owner, or let's say part of the community, and someone, let's say if, because back in the days I was running my own SI and I was a Magento partner, so I used to know that, okay, these are the features and functionality that are going to come. And MageOS is kind of a good initiative. Magento is also maintaining their own open source repository. So as a SI vendors, or let's say an implementation partners, you would always have an opportunity to see which one to pick and choose and leverage from, right? And the roadmap, we are like the page builder was recently made public. So that gives you a very strong CMS capability on top of Magento open source. So, and then coming with all those security checks and processes going through the Adobe world, I think it's good future for Magento community in short.
Yeah, I think part of the roadmap that if I remember right, I mean, there's a lot of the basic support, short-term or even long-term support, making sure like it's always in the latest framework. Yeah. I think you guys always keep getting the latest PHP framework and all this kind of stuff, and it's still doing really well. And that. And I think this is the beauty part of it, right? I think I like your presentation, Vikrant, when you say that the business is so varied, and then Magento and Adobe Commerce has been like a very good tool that able to cater for people crawling all the way to the rocket science and landing on the moon. And this is all about choices. And I think some of the complaint has been like, and part of the wake-up call and from the MageOS community that bring up is it's becoming too complex from the people that crawling, I think. And Vinai, I think you also involved in Hiva and stuff like that, which is I think part of that really try to make it easier back or for the people that is in that crawling state and stuff, so that it's still enjoyable and able to invest in a much lower cost. You might want to share a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are several issues why I think the direction of hybrid composable commerce Adobe is headed. There are certain dangers that introduces. One is because of the entry cost, the expense of the entry cost, it's rather high, and there's just by the size of the integration partners, companies, as well as team sizes, as well as license costs, it closes the opportunity for many of the smaller stores there. And by presenting the information in a way that makes it looks like the only real solution is Adobe Commerce, right? Everything else is just, well, you know, you can't really take it serious. That's discouraging to many stores, so they'd rather go elsewhere. Which in turn, the consequence of that is that we are seeing a lack of new developers moving into the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And that's not due to the platform itself. It's mainly due to the reduced visibility of Magento OpenSource being an ideal solution for many for many of the
small
stores
business,
of the merchants.
Yeah.
Right, small business. So what I want to encourage is to create a distribution of Magento open source where a developer can download it, start it, and it just works. And even right now, getting a working platform as a development environment is quite a complex undertaking. People who know how to work with it almost forget about how complex it is. But I work a lot in training, and it sometimes took people a week just to get that set up with, if you want to install them locally, well, you need to install Elasticsearch and Redis, and you have to get permissions correct, and well, oh no, Windows isn't even supported officially as a platform, so you're on your own anyway, and then you have the cron jobs, and it makes it really hard to get started. Then, of course, the answer is use Docker, or some kind of virtualized environment, or use something remote like Gitpod or whatever. But again, that isn't an option in many companies. Some big enterprise companies that I worked with tens of thousands of employees, they have certain security requirements, both in regards to data as well as software running on the computer. So they can't just use WSL2 with Docker on their system. Because company restrictions. And these restrictions are there for a reason. So what I want to have is, I want to make it possible for a junior developer, to take Magento, drop it on its file system, have MySQL and PHP, and that's it. Just get up and running again. And that will greatly increase the opportunity for new developers coming into the ecosystem. So it's not just, old guys like me and, Vikrant, you're not as old as I am, I guess, but you get it. We've been around for 10 years. We need people who've been around for 6 months. And there are many of these, but there could be a lot more because we need them. There's demand for these developers. So we need to make it easier to keep our ecosystem alive, right? To make it easier for companies to keep hiring good Magento developers and so on. And there are many costs associated with making the platform more exclusive to Adobe Commerce that aren't visible at first, and that's one of it.
Yeah, and there's always ability to bridge the two. I mean, like what we do here. I mean, as part of the circle, we created a version of the open source, but also where we work closely with Adobe Commerce to make sure that the enterprise that want to be able to jump into much more robust Adobe Commerce. I mean, all the stuff that we build can actually work on both, and that's the baby step toward the two. So I think that's kind of just showcases how much, I mean, I think there's a lot of miscommunication in the community, making it so it sounds like it's the end of the open source world or otherwise. But I think this kind of session is is just try to bring that clarity to a lot. I mean, because I know half of the audience here are also developers, so sorry for the business people if it's too techy for some of the topics. But from the business side, what we can say is, what we try to say is the vibrant of the community is still really live and kicking, and your investment on the platform is really is alive, and it's very wrong for the long term. And we all, from the community and from Adobe, have a both common commitment, basically try to bring this strong platform, continue to be the platform of choice for a lot of the merchants, all sizes. I guess I have to conclude. Yeah. It's a bit late now, Vinai. Thank you so much for your time, Vinai and Vikrant. I really enjoyed talking with you. We're definitely looking forward to see you flying here sometimes soon. And
as soon as we have hydrogen planes, it'll
exactly.
be a pleasure.
Thank you, Vinai.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vinai. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you. I'll give him back to MC.
Thank you so much, Pak Muliadi, Mr. Vikrant, and also Mr. Vinai. Now, I think we move on to Q&A session.
I think we'll probably, maybe one or two questions.
One or two questions.
I don't know, from the audience, maybe you have any questions. We can probably take just the last one or two questions.
Yes, if there's anything.
No? Oh, one.
Yeah, Thank you, Muliadi, and thank you, Vikrant and Vinai. That was a great session and also a great event. So kudos to Circlo and the entire team. So this was a very engaging session. So this is Karthik Chidambaram with DC Cap. So my question is, just listening to this, what's Adobe's incentive to invest on Magento, right? So, I mean, Vinay's thought process was really good. I mean, actually, I had no clarity because there were multiple open source systems lying around, and Vinay put it forward that they are working on Magento, it's Magento open source, and Adobe is Adobe Commerce. So, is there any bridge, or I mean, I understand, I think Muliadi's statement made it helpful. So, companies like Circlo make that bridge happen. But Adobe is not really motivated. Is that correct? Or?
I'll speak from my experience, both from Magento world and now being an Adobe employee. So Adobe's have already committed. We had Matt SE when Magento was acquired by Adobe, right? And he was the community in charge inside Adobe. He moved to AWS now. He was the most vocal guy and assuring that, hey, we are committed. So as I was telling you that we have got a recent release happening next week. We have published both the release notes. So it is 2.4.5 for Magento, and it is Adobe Commerce 2.4.5. What are the release notes? What are the backward incompatibilities, so on and so forth. The biggest and the most important motive is the community, because no company will want to let go so many intelligent people who are selflessly supporting an ecosystem, right? And they are the brain and mind and the word of mouth for that company. Having said that, we, as I was saying in my presentation, and as Muliadi tried to explain, that not all platforms are for everyone, right? So maybe Magento open source which is still relevant and which will be relevant in times to come and which will grow, because again, I being inside Adobe and still having that heart of an open source guy and the community, I still see a lot of internal conversations around Magento open source and how we can scale it and how we can help it grow compared to the other folks who are not in the room. So I can certainly say that Magento is going to be a primary offering for Magento, let's say for Adobe. And in fact, at times, maybe I have my sales team over here, they should not kill me for saying this, that in fact, at times, Magento open source is a competitor to Adobe Commerce, right? So we don't, at times, right, in some of the deals, right? So, but we need to understand that Magento open source is here to stay. It is not here to, it's not going to die. Adobe is not going to kill it. The best example is how Drupal and Acquia coexist. So that is the road model. If you see overall Magento Association being formed, similarly Drupal.org was formed, the product was handed over, and now they went into the same kind of a route. So both are coexisting. There are enterprise projects which are using Drupal as a front-end CMS, whereas Acquia is the one which should be used as a front-end CMS. So there is, and the short answer is, with Magento open source and Magento community is the core integral part of the commerce strategy of Adobe Commerce. Though Adobe Commerce, yes, that's a different product, different offering, and for different customers.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it for today.
Yeah?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much
Sure.
for the insightful session.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Hey, by the way, before I go,
But
can
say
you give me
here
my phone?
before.
Can we have a selfie, please?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah, please come ahead. You guys can settle after this. So please come, please come.
Come to the center, please,
Yeah.
so we can have a selfie with.
Yeah, let's have a selfie, guys. More people. Someone. Oh, you guys are lazy. Anyways, yeah, thank you. You guys have been good.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you guys.
Mr. Vikrant.